I'll be buried in my grave before I become a slave, yeah. That is what I heard them say way back in the day. I'll be buried in my grave before I become a slave, yeah, yeah, yeah. But it seems like since that day, yeah, yeah, we have sorely changed. Eh, eh, see, I'll be buried in my grave before I become a slave, yeah, yeah. That is what I heard them say, yeah. Way back in the day. I'll be buried in my grave, yeah, before I become a slave, yeah, yeah, yeah. But it seems like since that day, yeah, we have sorely changed. Whoa. Eh, eh. Whoa, oh, 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 oh. Whoa, oh, 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 oh.
And now, live from beautiful Myrtle Beach, South Carolina, you're watching My Fellow Americans with your host, Spike Cohen.
Yes! It's me! Yes, thank you so much. It's me. Keep clapping. Keep clapping. Clap for the miracle. I am still the Libertarian Party nominee. 1 week later, still strong Libertarian Party nominee. Clap if you knew that I would continue to be the nominee. How would we know that you knew that if you didn't keep clapping? Welcome to My Fellow Americans. I am literally Spike Cohen. Thank you for taking a break for your long day of social distancing and self-isolation to join me on this very special episode of My Fellow Americans, where I'm far away from you and we can continue to stay several feet away from each other. This is a Muddied Waters media production. Check us out on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, Anchor, Twitter, Twitch, Periscope, iTunes, Google Play, Float, everywhere. Check us out on all the podcasting apps and everything else. Muddy Waters Media taking over. Check us out everywhere. Be sure to like us, follow us, 5-star us, hit that bell if applicable. If there's a bell, be sure to hit it. And share this video right this very second. The last thing I want is for you and your closest loved ones to miss out on a roughly hour-long libertarian podcast on a Wednesday evening. Be sure to share the gift of Spike Cohen today. Kids love it. This episode, of course, is brought to you by the Libertarian Dad Bod Calendar, featuring some of the sexiest libertarian men to ever be on a calendar that you apparently would want for some reason. If you are still looking to socially distance, one of the most powerful ways is to carry this calendar around with you for only $12, including shipping. If you want it signed by the next Vice President of the United States of America, me, it's only $30, including shipping. LibertarianDadBod.com. This episode is also brought to you by the Libertarian Party Waffle House Caucus, the fastest growing Waffle House related caucus in the Libertarian Party. This episode, of course, is also brought to you by the Jorgensen-Cohen 2020 campaign. Joe Jorgensen and I are campaigning for a world set free in our lifetimes. Check us out on JOJ2020.com. This episode is brought to you by Black Coffee, which I'm told is an amazing coffee, even though I don't drink coffee, but I'm told it's great. I need to work on the plug for this coffee. But if you use the checkout code MW at checkout, you get free shipping and we get money as well. So be sure to do that. And I would like to... episode is also brought to you by Chris Reynolds, attorney at law. I don't have his picture, but go to Chris Reynolds Law if you need a personal injury attorney in Florida. Thank you so much. The intro and outro music to this and every episode of My Fellow Americans is brought to you by the amazing and talented Mr. Joe Davi. That's Jodavi. Check him out on Facebook, SoundCloud. Go to joedavimusic.bandcamp.com. buy his entire discography. It's like $25. It'll be the happiest, best purchase you make today. Thank you so much, Mr. Joe Davi. I'd like to thank Le Bleu for this delicious, ultra pure water that I'm drinking on this episode. Thank you so much, Le Bleu, Bulavanaka. That is delicious. Shout out to Tehran Turks' Mominum. As always, folks, we have got an awesome episode tonight for you. I have with me two incredible human beings who have been working for years advocating for our right to keep and bear arms in activism as well as in training. And they are joining us tonight to have a wide-ranging conversation with me about gun rights, civil liberties, police brutality, self-protection, and much more. So without further ado, here they are. First, she is a professional firearms instructor, as well as the owner of My Sister's Keeper Defense, a training organization that is dedicated to empowering women through safe firearms education with the aim of effectively educating 1 million women on firearms safety and fundamentals. She is Marchele Tig Davis, and she is the Director of Outreach for Gun Owners of America, and the founder of Empowered, a nonprofit group designed to educate, train, and equip young women in the use of firearms for protection on college campuses. She also has the distinction, which she makes known whenever possible, of being someone who knew me before I became famous. She is Antonia Okafor. Ladies, thank you so much for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Well, I'm really happy to have you on. This was actually Antonia's idea. And I wish I could take credit for it, but this is a fantastic idea with everything going on. I think what a perfect opportunity for us to talk about the issues that we are facing right now. Now, ladies, before we get started with our conversation, I wanted to give each of you a chance to tell our audience about the organizations that you're a part of and what you do as part of your involvement with them. And I will start with you, Antonia.
Yeah, so I'm the Director of Outreach for Gun Owners of America, which is 2 million members and activists strong, national organization, the only no-compromise gun lobby out there. And I started working with them last year when I brought on Empowered, which you talked about earlier, to the organization. And so I am now essentially doing that through GOA and doing a lot of other stuff when it comes to outreach. So yeah, that's what I'm doing now. I know it's crazy that I've been doing activism or being in this world for the last 5 years, and this is where I am now, and I think it's a perfect fit. But essentially why I really wanted to have this conversation is because I think, unfortunately, the 2A is being left out. And the original reason of why we have a Second Amendment and why the founders put that in there is kind of being passed over right now. So I'm really excited to talk about this tonight and to be able to really have an honest conversation about this.
That's great. We're glad that you joined us. And Tig, I will let you tell us about your, and I'll ask the question again because I already forgot how it was worded. But let's see here. So before we get started, I want to give you a chance to tell the audience about the organization that you're a part of and what you do as part of your involvement with them.
Yes, so I'm the owner of My Sister's Keeper Defense, formerly known as Trigger Happy Firearm Instruction. I started my firearms instruction company back in 2016, and I've been traveling the country since then to over 21 cities, and I've been able to teach close to 3,000 women basic handguns and fundamentals. I want to be that first face that they see when they're trying to learn about firearm safety and fundamentals. So I've been doing that for a few years. And then also I work for the United States Concealed Carry Association. I am a staff instructor here and a business development specialist also.
That's awesome. That is awesome. So, ladies, obviously the big news right now are the protests that are happening as a reaction to the rampant police brutality, including the recent murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, but also other high-profile killings of nonviolent people, such as Philando Castile, Tamir Rice, John Crawford, Duncan Lemp, Eric Garner, and seemingly countless others. What are your thoughts on these protests? And I'll start with you, Angela. I will start with you, Tig, and I will then let, again, this is a conversational thing, so anyone is free to chime in whenever you see fit. I will start with you, Tig. What are your thoughts on the protests and the police brutality that's happening?
I feel like it's something that's been going on for a very long time. It's just in recent years, in the last probably 10 years, we're starting to see these murders happen on video because of the spread of social media.
Right.
It's becoming more widely publicized, but it's been happening. And I don't think there was ever a time when police brutality wasn't an issue in this country, going back to slavery times and slave patrols. I feel like it's been an issue, but now that it's becoming more known, I think, it's a double-edged sword. One, we're being re-traumatized over and over from seeing these things and almost desensitized to them. But then two, now that everyone knows what's going on, we can do something about it. We can't turn a blind eye because now that we see it's happening, we can fix the issue. I think a lot of it has to do with racism, but then, on the other side with police being involved, a lot of it is just this authoritarian, mindset they have, and that's an issue. You're not the judge, jury, and executioner right there on the street. And the police have a hard job. I understand. My ex-husband's law enforcement, and it's a tough job. But at the same time, you have to have the right mindset to, be able to control people's livelihoods and freedom. And if you're not that type of person, that's not the job for you. And I feel like we have a lot of misalignment of personalities on our police forces, and people who really shouldn't be law enforcement who are acting in those roles. They don't have the mentality, they don't have the patience, they don't have the knowledge even of the communities they're policing to, have that role. So I think that's one of the biggest issues. And I'm sure we'll talk more about that too.
Yeah, and that's a good way of putting it. The misalignment of personalities of the people that are attracted to a kind of job where they really should try to be de-escalating, wouldn't you say, Antonia?
Yeah, and I mean, that's why I know this audience gets it better probably than any other. The fact that we understand individualism, and the fact that not just because there are a lot of, or in this case, we're talking about the cases where there are bad police officers, that obviously it's not all police officers. And I think most people get that, although sometimes people surprise me and really just think it's just one or the other. I think for the most part, we all reasonably minded people understand that there are quote unquote bad apples. But being in a system that encourages that attracts people to that, it's really important, just like a gun owner, to, with great power comes great responsibility. And the fact that they are unique in being part of the government, which has a monopoly of force. So it's important, very important, that we continue to check and keep accountability strong within that system. And I think that's what people are really calling for right now.
And that's an excellent point. And I actually have a follow-up question for both of you, and I'll start with you. Something that Tig had mentioned, that right now with the proliferation of, this might not be a case where police brutality is getting worse. It may just be a case where, because we all have HD cameras and instant access to live streaming on social media, we're just able to see it when it's happening, instead of it just being one person or a few people that witnessed it who then told some other people, and the rest of us may never hear about it unless you're in that community. Now people that are maybe in communities like mine where we don't see a lot of that happening, and we're only ever hearing of it from people who lived in other neighborhoods, we're now seeing. My question to you is, do you think that runs the potential risk of us just, and Tig had mentioned this, becoming sort of desensitized to it and just starting to treat it like, well, that's just, it's just something that happens and there's nothing we can do about it?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's really sad to see is, or think about, like, for example, even Breonna Taylor, people are talking about it right now, like, where's the justice for her? Yeah. Or even Kenneth Walker, her boyfriend, who was arrested. Mm-hmm. And it's sad to say is that it's more than likely she's not getting the attention that she deserves, at least the equal attentions, because she didn't have a viral video that accompanied her tragedy. But yeah, at the end of the day, it is nice that we do have people every day who are able to record these situations. Of course, what I would rather not have these situations at all, so we don't have to record any of them, of course, but that is why we're seeing it more often. That is why we see the public outcry. In case of Ahmaud Arbery, we wouldn't have that happened in March, and because of the viral video is why something's happening. So yeah, it's kind of a double-edged sword, but for the most part, it has been very helpful of keeping people accountable. I just wish it would be more preventative than, reactionary. That's a good point. Tig, she brings up a great point that, especially in the case of Ahmaud Arbery, the common phrase that we keep hearing is they didn't get arrested because they saw the video. They got arrested because we saw the video. So do you agree that it's probably more good than bad that we're seeing this up front and up close? I mean, it's absolutely great that we are being able to watch what happens. And, you can't argue with video. It can be he said, she said, but I saw what happened on the video. So, I mean, how can you argue those things that we are watching, and we can speculate and dissect the video, but I saw George Floyd's murder. You can say what you want, but it's on video. So I think that is the one benefit of having these incidents and these murders filmed is that, you can't argue with the video evidence. It's proof. And it's unfortunate that some of the other cases like Breonna Taylor's, where there was no video are almost being ignored. And, I find issue with that. And I think it's also an issue that, she's a Black woman, which if we consider, if certain people think of Black people as second-class citizens, Black women are almost third-class citizens because, the patriarchy that runs this country, women are less important or seen as less important than men are. There are so many women who've been victims of police brutality who we never hear their names. No one ever shares their stories. People aren't marching for these women. And, it's patriarchy, but it's also racism too. So yeah, I'm glad that we do have the evidence, but I really do wish it was a preventative measure. Like, hey, don't do this bad thing because it's going to be seen around the world. You're going to get fired. You're going to prison. Yep. That's pretty much the end of your life. But apparently, that's not as big of a deterrent as we thought it would be. Yeah. That's also true. You brought up a good point. According to statistics, Black women are actually the most likely to disproportionately suffer from police brutality. And yet, for whatever reason, often when we talk about a disproportionate use of force against people of color, it's Black men that we focus on. And I'm sure there are many theories. You brought up a couple of them, but there are probably a few different theories as to why that is. I want to go through a couple of these comments. First of all, there are a ton of comments here saying how you are both amazing and the work that you do is incredible. Some people lamenting that this is one of the rare episodes where I am not the most attractive person on the show. What do we have here? John S. Hurtley said, most of us had to block Facebook friends because they show their racism. It's sad to see so many ill-informed opinions about our human family. So that kind of brings us to our next question here. We know from the law enforcement data that people of color are much more likely to die at the hands of the police, especially if they aren't armed. And we've just been talking about that. And I believe it was you, Tig, that mentioned that the origins of modern policing in the U.S. are rooted in the slave patrols of the Deep South during the era of chattel slavery. Do you believe that the continued disproportionate harm against people of color at the hands of law enforcement is something that can't be avoided due to the nature of its origins and the structure that it has as a result of that? Or do you think that there are ways to reform it? And I'll start with you on this question, Tig. Yes, I absolutely think there are ways to reform it. And, I've been trying to find out ways myself. How can I influence and affect change in my own communities? And what can I do? How can I help fix things just in my small area that I live in, maybe not even on a federal or national level. And, some of the ideas I came up with were, talking to my ex-husband, were getting familiar with the area that you're going to patrol. A lot of the law enforcement officers, where I was living in, like Clayton County, Georgia, near Atlanta, they were from other counties. They had never lived in Clayton County, where it's a majority Black populace.
they had never experienced dealing with, these Black people, these cultures. There are certain, cultural norms and standards in some of these communities that they're not familiar with. There's, slang, there's colloquialisms, there's so many different subtle nuances to that culture that if you're not from there and you're not used to it, it can be fearful. You can be afraid of a culture that you don't understand. And now you are enforcing laws in that community that you don't understand. I find a problem with that. I feel like, if anything, that's probably one of the biggest changes we can make, is some sort of integration process. Maybe you have to live in the county where you're going to be a police officer for a certain amount of time, before you're able to patrol there. You're coming from a different place. You don't understand the culture or the history of the place where you're enforcing laws. And I feel like that's a lot of the issues that we're finding with law enforcement. And that's why there's so much irrational fear of the people that they are policing.
And there's also an implicit bias there often against people of color, even if they aren't recognizing it. Antonia, do you agree with that? Do you think that it's something that can be reformed through measures, or do you think, because of the nature of how these organizations started, that, it may not be something that can be fixed?
Yeah, well, I think it's good that you brought up the fact that, even then, obviously, that wasn't the beginning of, not even America, but even before that, It's essentially a modern institution relatively to, American history. I think it's 1830s, the first Boston police force was actually in existence. And so this whole idea that we have a modern policing, I think, first of all, people think it's always existed. It's always been exactly the same. It's always been like what Tig was saying, is that it's people outside of your community. It's a professionalized force, but a lot of history shows it's very much the opposite. It was more of a private security type of thing, or the Second Amendment, right? The people who actually had guns or firearms, that's what they were doing, is how they were protecting their property and their livelihoods and the people that they care about. So with that in mind, I think also, but yeah, you were talking about implicit bias. My husband's white, and so we were actually having this conversation last few weeks about what's going on. I'm pregnant, about to have a baby in the next few months, and just thinking about our future child and how are people going to look at him and stuff like that. So, even my husband talked about the fact that he grew up in Houston, and it was a very diverse community that he lived in, but he has always grown up with the idea that cops is a good thing. That if you're lost, you go to a cop. If you're scared, if you feel threatened, you go to a cop. Versus a lot of his friends, he remembers when cops would come to them, a lot of his Black friends would leave, would feel threatened, would run away. It was a very different response. And do I think that's because all cops are bad? Obviously not. But because there is that implicit bias on both sides, right? There are people in the society that think because of the color of your skin that you might come from a rougher neighborhood, or you might be a rougher person, or in general. Versus also, if you are Black and you're looking at a police officer, you're not sure if that they're really for you or they're really a threat. So I think that's part of it, is that there's people who don't really know each other, like Tig was saying, not in the same community. Maybe it would have been different if you had known that police officer growing up for most of your life. Obviously, it's going to be different. But if you have somebody different from a different community coming in, you have no idea who they are or where they're coming from.
So that alone could actually help, even if there's still differences in race, and even if there's still differences in implicit or inherent bias or unconscious bias. Just the fact that they know each other would help to, or at least are familiar with each other, would help to deal with those types of things. That's a good, it's a good point. I'm certainly not against the idea of kind of requiring localization of police officers. Now, both of you are obviously women of color, and you have started organizations that are heavily involved with encouraging women to take control of their protection by utilizing their right to keep and bear arms and to learn how to effectively use them. What would a society look like in which most women, including women of color, were armed and trained to use their weapons? And I'll start with you this time, Antonia.
Oh man, what would it look like? You know what? Fortunately, I think we're seeing a lot more of that. that. Man, the last week or so, I've gotten so many requests for training, especially since COVID essentially has disappeared now because, everyone's doing protests. So obviously it's gone. So people are just like, okay, Antonia, can you come out and teach us? And so it's a lot of other black women. And this is Denver, okay? This is probably like all the black women probably in all Colorado together at one time. There's not many people here. So it's been nice to be able to see that, encouragement. But we've seen, the thing is, it's not new. The studies have shown it's been trending that more women of color, more specifically more black women, are utilizing firearms, and it has always made sense to me. If you look at what's happening right now, I mean, if you don't trust law enforcement, then who else are you going to trust? You have to trust yourself.
Exactly.
And really, safety goes, it comes down to you at the end, or even people maybe in your household, but that's it. So we're having this conversation about defunding the police, about reforming the police and law enforcement in general. So really, it is going to be more so even about like what you are doing. Are you trained? Do you have a firearm? Are you able to get one now because of things like when COVID happens and you're in a 2-week wait to be able to get a firearm or get your background processed, or even to be able to get your permit, because they weren't even issuing permits for a while because it wasn't considered an essential
service. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So I think a lot of people are just realizing, hey, it's up to me. So
that's a good point. So Tig, that is, we're talking about, the possibility of either, and we'll get into that later, but either defunding or reforming police. If there's less, heavy police involvement, that would kind of inherently mean that you would want to have more people that would be able to defend themselves, especially women, and especially women of color. So is that how you think that would look, that there wouldn't be as much need for law enforcement, or?
I mean, I feel like people should be their own protectors. And what people forget too about law enforcement is that they're not your personal security. They're there, you call them after something has happened. They don't wait outside your house for someone to break in.
Right.
They're law enforcement. They're there to enforce laws, and protect and serve while it's a nice slogan, that's not their primary role, to make sure nothing bad ever happens to you. So whether we defund the police, whether we go through police reform, or whether nothing changes at all, you should always, like Antonia was saying, you should always be your first line of self-defense, especially for women. I was reading some articles about what happened during COVID, and domestic violence occurrences and situations spiked because women are locked indoors with their attackers with no way for them to defend themselves. Sexual assaults were on the rise. As a sexual assault and domestic violence survivor myself, I understand how complicated that situation can be when you're trapped with your attacker and you have no way out, and then social distancing and quarantine on top of that. You have literally no escape. There's nowhere to go. There's no reprieve from, the abuse you're suffering at home.
Right.
And
right. No, I was agreeing with you.
Yeah, I definitely think women especially should have a way to protect themselves. And, it's the great equalizer. Like we always say, my strength versus a man's strength, it's not equal. We're physically different. But with the firearm, I can be as strong as that attacker. So I absolutely think we do need to make sure more women, especially women of color, get this firearms education.
That's a good point, because I am just super strong. When we think of self-protection, we typically think of protection against abusers, home intruders, things that you were just talking about, sexual abuse and the like. But we also see it in other arenas. One example, in my opinion, you two can definitely tell me if and when I'm wrong, is the difference of treatment by police against for example, the anti-lockdown protesters from last month, many of whom were openly armed, and the Black Lives Matters protesters this month, the vast majority of whom have been unarmed. It appeared, at least to me, as though the police are less eager to use tear gas and batons and tasers and pepper spray against people who are all armed with guns. Am I missing the mark here? Because it's also true that the anti-lockdown protesters also happen to be mostly white, although there are many, Black Lives Matter protesters who are white as well. Or is it that the prevalence of firearms ownership is a deterrent to police brutality? And I will start with you, Tig.
I think it's a little bit of both. Obviously, if I'm armed and I'm openly carrying, and there are a mass of us who are armed and openly carrying, the police don't want a shootout. They don't want an incident to escalate to that, to that magnitude where there's 50 armed civilians and 50 law enforcement officers, having an open shootout in the street. Nobody wants that scenario to happen, especially not law enforcement and our politicians. They don't want to see that. Right. However, I think seeing African Americans armed at these peaceful Black Lives Matter protests will, make sure that they are treated differently, just like the other protests that have happened from the anti-lockdown. I think it's the African Americans or Black people are seen as more aggressive with firearms than their white counterparts. So that's one issue. It's just law enforcement isn't used to seeing that. It's not normalized. So it's automatically a radical idea when you think of it in the first place. Automatically when you look at a Black Panther, a group of people who created welfare programs in their own communities, and they fed women and children, and education programs and literacy programs. When you think of a Black Panther, a lot of people, their first thought is radical and bad person and terrorist, violent, and you hear those things. But when there are these other groups who are comprised of mostly white people carrying firearms, you don't think radical, you don't think crazy, you don't think you don't think these extremes. And I feel like a lot of that has to do with obviously going back to slavery and gun ownership, post-slavery, being illegal for Black people. But two, it's the stereotypes of, Black people being more aggressive, the stereotypes of us being thugs or criminals, the media, movies, TV, music, it's all right. It's all come together to create this narrative that Black people with firearms are extremists. And that's one thing that I've been working to change. And I know people like Antonia, her representation, just the fact that she is a Black woman who has a firearm, that's changing the narrative that we're not angry, we're not irrational, we're law-abiding citizens, and we just want to protect ourselves just like every other tax-paying citizen in this country.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, Antonia, same question to you. Do you think that having more armed protesters at these rallies, including more armed Black protesters, would help to kind of calm things down among the police because no one wants to bring pepper spray to a gunfight? Or do you think that there's the potential that because of the implicit bias and the stereotyping of Black people, that it could potentially actually trigger the police to be even more brutal? Or do you think possibly some mixture of those?
Yeah, I've gotten questions, particularly it would always be media, the question of, well, do you really think that if you, like that same thing, that if it were an African American who had a firearm versus a white person, if a police officer, would see the African American person as less of a threat, or if not more of a threat? And it's not something that I'm going to be like, oh, well, yeah, it's going to be totally fine. That's right. Just not completely accurate. Even me as a Black woman, I'm a trained person with firearms and I've been used to this, but there are sometimes I'm like, well, that other person doesn't know who I am. All they see is my skin color. Maybe they have a bias, maybe they don't. I don't know. And so I'm not gonna lie and say like I don't fear those type of things or those type of situations. Right. And unfortunately, I also think that I feel like I, just like with a lot of different areas, and I'm sure other people feel this way too, understand this, is where you feel like you have to even be more of an upstanding citizen, to really show that you're fine, that you're okay, and so do I think that it's going to go away if we just, like some people want, where they literally don't want Black people to have firearms or not to have or gun-free zones in where Black people are? Right. With campus carry movement, I remember specifically in UT Austin saying that they shouldn't have campus carry anywhere predominantly African American people congregate on campus.
Who was saying this?
Racist.
Who was saying this? Right?
Oh, these are the professors at UT Austin. Oh, wow. This is a real quote. From a whole manifesto that they had of, they shouldn't have it near any Black, specifically Black conversation classes and African American studies and stuff like that. They shouldn't. they're not thinking, oh wait, maybe those black people also should have guns too, but you're actually keeping them from having it. I digress. It's a completely, it's messed up and distorted, but that is what you're seeing in the larger picture, is people who think, well, then black people should just not have firearms, or you just shouldn't have firearms around black people. I think the opposite. I think the more, like Sig was saying, the more that people see black people with a firearm, specifically black men, I think black men especially get the prejudice even worse than black women, I think. They are seen as more aggressive and stuff like that. Right. My brother, I mean, he's 6'2", like long dreads and stuff like that. He's like he's a chemical engineer. And I mean, obviously I understand he's a nerd, but no one else doesn't see him like that, right? So I'm concerned about his safety even more so when he wants to open carry or carry in general. So it's something to think about.
And that's a perfect example of this, because, you know, you just said your brother's a chemical engineer. So I'm going to assume he's not a thuggish chemical engineer. I mean, maybe there is such a thing, but I doubt it. And yet many people, when they see him, are going to make a lot, especially if he's just wearing, you know, daily, you know, walking around clothes and, you know, he's not dressed up or whatever. People are going to make a lot of very unfair and potentially dangerous assumptions about him, dangerous for him, assumptions about him. When I've been seeing these protests with, you know, lots of pictures of, you know, black people. And of course, right now with COVID-19, they're wearing masks. So I'm seeing black people with masks holding guns. Of course, I'm an anarchist, so I'm like, let's do this. Like, I'm happy. But I know that a lot of people look at that and they're like, no, this is a problem. But if they were white people that were dressed in more traditionally, you know, white attire, and, you know, also had their masks on, their you know, American flag, Trump MAGA masks on, and their guns, everyone would go, yep, Second Amendment, you know, that's what our founders fought for. And so it's very much an implicit thing. Now, Tig, you mentioned this, and you know, we don't really know because how the public would respond, because we know in the past, whenever large groups of black people would, you know, have guns, governments would pass sweeping gun control largely to stop specifically them from carrying in public. Most notably, in more recent history, in the 1960s, you had talked about, you know, when the slaves were freed, they immediately, the first gun control acts in this country were to prevent freed slaves from being able to own guns, for the, I guess, somewhat understandable concern that people who had been owned and treated like cattle for many centuries might actually now be upset and go after the people who robbed them of everything that they had, which maybe they should have. But anyway, all that to say, we know that, for example, in the 1960s, when Black Panthers were going to legislatures, open carrying, not harming anyone, keeping perfect trigger discipline, but making a lot of white people very uncomfortable, Ronald Reagan signed laws that banned open carry in California, with the blessing of the NRA, of course, to stop the Black Panthers. Do you think that there is an aspect of this where the more people see black people in general, people of color, people who don't fit the normal, I guess, stereotype of Americans who own and walk around with guns, the better that will be, that over time that will normalize? Or do you think it has the risk of doing the opposite, where people become more and more concerned about it?
I think eventually it will normalize Black gun ownership. And I actually created an event to help fix that exact problem. The treating Black people like they're criminals because they're gun owners, and having Black people be afraid to exercise their Second Amendment rights because of all the stereotypes and the fear of being treated differently. And it's called the National Range Day. So this Saturday, I have coordinated with over 100 instructors across the country, 100 Black instructors across the country. And we are all going to our local gun ranges wearing all Black, and we are giving free advice, free tips. We're helping Black people who go to the range buy firearms, buy classes, get their carry permits, become a member at their range. And this is happening Saturday. I will be in Atlanta, Georgia, actually hosting the National Range Day Atlanta version at Stoddard's. And we're expecting to have 300 to 400 people show up just at that one range. Wow. So when we see, it's going to be major. And when we see these images next week, so guns.com just did an article about it. The USCCA posted it. But when we see the actual images of all these Black people wearing all Black, going to their gun ranges and shooting together next week, there's going to have to be some sort of conversation. Oh, yeah. Of course, there's going to be pushback, but people are going to have to say, wait a minute, these people are getting legally trained. They're getting educated from certified firearms instructors. There is a shift happening right now in front of our eyes, and maybe we should pay attention, or maybe we can reconsider our thoughts about Black gun ownership.
That's awesome. Now, Antonia, do you tend to agree that the more people see just generalized, Black people that are, carrying firearms, and they're not thugs, they're like anyone else that are carrying firearms, they're doing it for their self-protection and their protection of themselves as a community, do you think that will serve to kind of normalize things over time?
Yeah, absolutely. So Tig invited me to be one of those instructors here in Colorado. So I will be participating in that as well on Saturday.
That's awesome.
And I'm really excited. I'm really excited to, meet a lot of people in the community, even more so, but specifically after everything that's been happening. I think a lot more people are interested. They're open-minded to, again, that idea of self-defense. And but unfortunately, I remember as a student of the cost prohibitive aspect of training, of going to the gun range, and it's intimidating too. There's a lot of people who are just intimidating when you go to a gun range.
It's a new thing. Any new thing can be intimidating. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. But then also add that, the fact that, your skin color or whatever things that you may have that just keep you from even going through the door in the first place. So I hope I'm really excited to just participate in that and see other images like what she's saying is it is important for people to see that, but it is also important for us to remember that unfortunately, just because more people are going to see us and know that we're legally armed and stuff like that, doesn't mean that there's not going to be injustices like what we've seen with like Kenneth Walker. He legally owned a firearm, and he was 1 a.m. in the morning, no knock order. Going through, he thought someone was trying to break into his apartment, and
someone was trying to break into his apartment. They just had legal authorization to do so. Yeah, no, exactly.
Yeah, exactly. Someone that someone ended up being law enforcement,
right.
and that's the issue. And he wasn't released until a few weeks ago. And GOA, we put out a statement on that, on no knock orders, and how it's dangerous, not obviously for that party, but for both parties. And that's why we've been against red flag laws. Part of the reason, of course, it's unconstitutional, but the fact that no knock orders never are really good for anybody, but yet they still persist, particularly in like you said, non-violent crimes like a drug issue or a drug crime. So things like that, things like we saw with the Martin Arbery, where I was on the Grapevine a few weeks ago after that happened, and I was the only pro-gun person essentially on that panel, but they were listening and they were saying, okay, yeah, all right, gun rights, that's cool. But at the end of the day, this is their words, I'm still a Negro with a gun. And at the end of the day, if you see things like Philando Castile and you see things like Kenneth Walker and people who were illegally owned a firearm, but still didn't get the justice that they deserved, or like Ahmaud Arbery didn't even get the due process to even use the defense that he was shooting someone with self-defense. And in fact, the McMichaels were able to use that the first time. It's absolutely absurd. Then people start to think, okay, well, even if I did things legally in the right way, is the system still going to protect me? And I think that's important that we bring up those two types of concerns that people have, particularly in the Black community.
Because you can't just flippantly, it's easy for me to say, well, if more of you had guns, then it would be a lot. No, it wouldn't in and of itself be easier because of that bias, because of the stereotype. Side note here, we keep talking about, and I hate that we're in this defensive situation where we keep having to say, well, Black people aren't thugs. Every thug we've talked about during this episode have been white people, most of them employed by the government, who have, either gunned people down in the middle of the road or broken into people's houses and killed them for wanting to defend themselves against home invasion. They did it to Fred Hampton, and they did it to Kenneth Taylor?
Kenneth Walker.
We see this time and again. They killed Tamir Rice and John Crawford for holding what were obviously BB guns. So, you know, if you want to talk about thugs, let's talk about the people that are going around killing people en masse largely with impunity and often not even being punished for it, and having people defending them for it. That's a whole other subject. But this brings us to...
While you're on that, too,
go ahead.
real quick, you know, we keep talking about these bad apples. I feel like law enforcement is one field where you cannot have any bad apples. Like,
I agree.
One is too many. That's unacceptable. And we need to figure out a way to eradicate all of the bad apples from law enforcement now. It's like saying, well, we have a pilot who, you know, lands safely 50% of the time. Like, we can't have any bad pilots flying airplanes where people's lives are in danger, you know, or, you know, can be in danger from their actions. We have to have great law enforcement officers or none. Like, if we don't have great law enforcement officers, then there's no other exception. If you're not top of the line law enforcement, if you're not treating everyone fairly and safely and responsibly, then you should not be a law enforcement officer at all. Find another job. It's not for you.
And the people need to be able to... Oh, go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry, Antonia.
I was going to say with that, like with George Floyd, the police officer that killed him, had 17 infractions before, had 17 write-ups. So obviously, when people are like, "Oh, we're trying to do better," like, what other profession would you be able to have 17 chances?
Exactly.
And
after
not have a firearm and not have all those other things that comes with it.
17 chances where you have beaten or killed people. Like, it's not 17 chances like I yelled at the customer because they came in and gave me an attitude, or, you know, I skimmed some money from the cash register. I either beat up or killed people 17 times, and a board looked at that and went, yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. Which is, I mean, it's a reason to end qualified immunity, because I think a lot of these bad apples, we just saw in Buffalo where the police, there were two police that knocked over an old man that was handing them their helmet, and as a result, those two are now being charged. And the police union said if any of the people on this protest detail are charged with anything, we will not legally protect them from being sued. 57 of them quit from that detail as a result of that. Now, I got news for you. The people that quit are not the people who are the ones that we don't want to quit. Like, the ones who didn't quit are the ones who said, that's fine. I don't plan on beating anyone up or abusing anyone. If I use force, it'll be for a reason, so I'm not worried about being sued. The ones who quit are the ones who went, whoa, wait a second. We knock people over all the time. We treat them like garbage. We deny them their right to you know, peacefully assemble. I don't want to get sued over that. So just ending qualified immunity would fix a lot of that. But so there seems to be a paradoxical belief among many, I would say most, in the conservative movement, that government shouldn't be trusted and that the Second Amendment was written to allow us to fight against tyrants. And they talk about how the tree of liberty must be refreshed with the blood of tyrants and patriots. But then at the same time, they say that we should always comply with the orders of law enforcement. And if they harm us, it's probably our faults. Do you two see the same things? And where do you think that comes from? And I forget who I asked first last time. So I think it was Tig last time that I asked first. So I'll ask Antonia this time. I apologize if I got that wrong.
You're fine. Yeah, I think that's what I've been seeing a lot of, and particularly from the eye of seeing things through the Second Amendment and stuff like that. It's been really concerning to see that, you know, the ones that are usually on the 2A side, on some of them, I'm not going to say all of them, but usually they are, and usually they understand the concept of we are our own first responders, et cetera, until, you know, the last week where the whole defund police and abolish police or whatever narrative that's going through. And I understand they're trying to essentially go against this narrative that seems very to the extreme. But what they're doing is essentially giving the left another option of, oh, well, you said yourself that police should be the first responders. And that's why it's so important that they're not disbanded, that they still have as much funding as they need, and et cetera, et cetera. So you're essentially saying that we are not our own first responders. What happened to the Second Amendment there? And so I think it's really important that that narrative does not take over the fact that, look, the founders were not looking at, oh, what about police? Police officers, I I hate to break it to some people, but they are actually funded by the government. They're part of the government.
Turns out they're actually a part of the government.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Yep.
I know this is gonna get a lot of people mad. Apparently,
it's really controversial, but the police are
and stuff like that.
It's very controversial, but the police are actually part of the government. Turns out.
Yeah, very controversial to say that. So that is part of what the Constitution is about. Is they are tyrannical government, and those who enforce those laws, those who make those laws, those who interpret those laws, if they are tyrants, then we have to have an ability to go against those people, but also go against the people who are making those laws and making sure that there's a system that enforces those people to be enforcers of those unconstitutional laws. So just saying, I think it's important that we stay consistent, but don't forget the Second Amendment and that the fact that, we are our own first responders. And then after the fact, yes, we do need people who are going to uphold their oath of upholding the Constitution and protecting our rights. That's really what police officer and law enforcement are there for. The government is there for, period.
Tig, your reaction to seeing people with their "Don't Tread on Me" sticker right next to their thin blue line sticker?
I think honestly that paradox or that idea only applies to certain people. Mm-hmm. You know, they're like, hey, if you're black, comply. If you're black, don't run away. You won't get shot. If you're black, just do what they say. Yeah. But if it were them or someone who looked like them, I don't think they would be singing the same tune. And I think again, it's a lot of racial undertones in that thought process. The police lives matter, thin blue line. A lot of that messaging and that rhetoric came after Black Lives Matter, started saying their sayings and Black Lives Matter,
all of it.
And then the opposition of that, or the response to that, is no, all lives matter and police lives matter. And it's saying that what I'm saying with all lives matter is the exact opposite of what you're saying. That's the message that we're getting. And I feel like that just comply, just listen. But oh no, I'm a patriot. I'm a part of the Boogaloo. Like all of that is you're setting different rules for different types of people. So if you're gonna say, okay, I believe in small government, I believe I am my first responder, then that should apply to everyone. But unfortunately, with what they're actually saying is that no, this only applies to me and people who look like me. Everyone else, you're on your own, and that is the issue.
And Spike, I mean, this is a libertarian moment. I don't know. This is where people on the libertarian side can say, oh yeah, well, usually a lot of times conservatives, they are okay with big government on certain issues. It's on certain parts of government that they're okay with. And so, I think that's on the 2A side. We've always been appreciative of the Libertarian Party of being consistent on that. But also the fact that on the government issue, if you really believe in limited government, and there are constitutional conservatives and stuff like that who do believe that and accountability, but you need to stay consistent because people are watching you and you're giving them a reason to not trust you next time or call you a hypocrite. People have been coming to me about, I'm getting in trouble from everybody. That's usually what I get. And I posted a picture about the Black Panthers who were protecting BLM protesters in Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And I definitely got people who are like, oh yeah, absolutely. Like, Second Amendment's for everybody. And then they're like, at the same time, you look at the other post and you're like, oh, well, not those, not those
them,
Americans.
Not for them, everybody else, but not specifically them. Yeah,
exactly. Obviously, Antonia. So that's, it's part of that is that we have to show that, we have to expose that type of hypocrisy and show that it doesn't help it doesn't help others want to be on our side when we do stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah. I will say libertarians at this moment should be the ones coming out. And I will say, I'm the vice presidential nominee, and I've certainly been coming out saying, hey, listen, folks, we're the ones that have been wanting to scale down the police and increase, private gun ownership from the beginning. Like, we've been consistent on this issue. There's never been a time when we, at least not as a movement, have ever said, oh yeah, we need more government involvement in law enforcement. And there's never been a time that we've said, oh yeah, government, fewer people should have guns of any race. By the way, I have to, Tig, I'm sorry, I have to defend the Boogaloo people. You triggered me slightly there. No, I do, because there are definitely some that are what you're talking about, but I will say that I have some boog boys that are in my campaign team who are actually have gone to to Minnesota and have gone to Atlanta and have gone to Louisville and have gone to New York specifically to protect the protesters and get out in the front in between them and the police, not in a threatening way, but simply to just say, yeah, we're here with our Hawaiian shirts and our tactical equipment and all of that stuff. And, hopefully now things can remain calm. And oddly enough, they didn't experience anyone tear gassing or pepperballing anyone. So I will say, obviously it takes all kinds, but I will say that the Boog Boys I associate with it, at the very least, have been incredibly understanding of this situation and have really been in front of it. But I think that's also a difference between those who are libertarians and those who are kind of just more conservative and like Hawaiian shirts or whatever. So that kind of brings us to the next thing. In recent days, we've seen... Actually, I'll start with this first, because this is my show and I'm running for office. Joe Jorgensen and I, ladies, are proposing a series of police controls at the federal level to combat police brutality, including ending qualified immunity, ending the military surplus program, ending civil asset forfeiture, using the Department of Justice to aggressively go after abusive officers and departments with a history of brutality, and much more. I'm obviously not asking you to endorse our campaign or anything like that, but I will ask you, do you think that these measures would be helpful? And what other actions do you think could be taken at the federal and state level to deal with this problem with police? And I know we've touched on that a little, but what other things do you think would be helpful? Tig. I think Tig was next. I apologize. I'm having a hard time keeping track of.
No worries. So all of the things that you listed, I think, are great ideas for police reform. And just like we talked about earlier, having those police officers have to spend some time and integrate into that community. Also, just from a firearms, using firearms perspective, a lot of law enforcement don't have the training that they need to be as accurate and as efficient with firearms as they should be. If you carry a firearm every day for your job and you only have to qualify once a year, that's an issue. Or the only time you ever shoot is the week before qualification. That's the only practice you have, but you carry a firearm and are authorized to use it for your full-time job. I find issue with that. I think we need to standardize or reform just the firearms qualification for post-certification. There needs to be continuous training. I feel like it should also be free. A lot of departments, but not all, a lot of departments do give law enforcement officers free training and free ammunition to go to ranges. But, I think there needs to be some sort of standardized testing, some sort of recertification, maybe quarterly instead of just annually. Also physical fitness. I'll take a direct quote from my ex-husband who was talking about, use of force with law enforcement. And he says that a lot of use of force issues are because they don't have the endurance to fight. So a lot of issues are escalated to using force because hand-to-hand combat is not a strong suit.
Or running after them,
officers.
Or running after them, or something like that.
Right, or running after, giving chase, things like that. That could be the reason why a lot of these incidents are getting escalated when it could have just been a fist fight, where it could have just been a tumble, or it could have just been a ground fight, are now escalating to now I'm using my weapon. And I think all kinds of combatives, hand-to-hand combat tactics training should be taught to law enforcement. Like, what are the other alternatives to shooting a person that we can make sure you're trained on? And then also physical fitness, height, weight requirements like we had in the military. Are you in shape? Are you physically fit to do this job to the best of your ability? And if you're not, then maybe this is not the job for you. Things like that I feel like need to be considered and standardized across the country.
Yeah. Antonia, you perked up there for a second when Tig said it. Are police not given free training for firearms usage? Am I misunderstanding that?
Yeah, they're not, and they have to pay for ammo. They have to pay for range time. I used to work at a gun range as a trainer, and I would see it all the time. Like she was saying, yeah, when they were qualifying, it was like a week before. But yeah, a lot of the departments are not paying for not only like ammo and things like that, but they're not paying for scenarios like home defense or I know in Dallas, for example, I remember finding out that it was right after that police officer, the white woman who
Amber
shot
Geiger.
the man. Yeah. And I was like, surely the Dallas Police Department have, scenario training like the one I was going through at the time in Dallas, and they said no, they don't get training like that unless they're paying for it out of their own pocket.
That is
and
horrifying.
So yeah, absolutely. So things like that, most people are not going to know about that unless they're in law enforcement or they're in the field of like dealing with or working with law enforcement, particularly on the qualification aspect of things. But that is a huge problem. And if anything, it's also kind of mind-boggling of all these budgets that you hear about, and you're just like, they can't afford to even make sure that they have the training they need. So where is the money going? So they're doing a disservice to the actual people, the law enforcement that are in those police departments. So yeah, that's a big problem.
Of all the things they're not funding, I mean, they're driving around in mine-resistant, personnel carriers, and they got rocket launchers, and they don't give them the ammo needed to that is insane. Tig, you mentioned in the military, not only are they far more trained, but their, as I understand it, their rules of engagement are far more defensive in nature than what police are expected. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the rules of engagement for when force can be used by military overseas.
Yeah, I think he got.
Are you still there?
Yes, there you go.
Okay. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the military actually has stricter rules of engagement for dealing with people that they're fighting overseas than the police do here. Is that not correct?
I can't speak for every police department, but in some cases, yes. And then also there's, for military, and again, it's very different, it's apples and oranges, but there's a lot more consistent training. Imagine being a police officer for you have to go through 10 weeks of training to pass post certification. So you've only had 10 weeks of training. In that 10 weeks, you have to learn about use of force. You have to learn EVOC, which is the driving, how to maneuver your vehicle. You have to learn the laws in 10 weeks. That's a lot of information to try to squeeze in 10 weeks, and then to not have standardized continuous training like the military has. Every year we had to go through training. Every quarter there were classes and recertifications that we had to go through. There were physical fitness tests. We took a PT test almost every single month to make sure we stayed physically fit. And we don't have that with law enforcement, where there's some sort of standardization of recertifying for multiple things, not just the once a year going to the range. And I feel like they need more training, period. They just need more training. I feel like it should be federally funded. If they're government employees or funded by the government should pay for it. Those classes, the instructors, the ammo, the range fees, all of it should be paid for. You have no excuse as a law enforcement officer to go get that additional training that you need to do your job.
Someone needs to be paying for it. That is horrifying that the people who are authorized to use guns as they see fit with qualified immunity don't have more training on actually using them in public. That's holy crap. So in recent days, one of the measures that we've seen getting increasing momentum behind is the defund the police movement. What are your thoughts on defunding the police? Is abolishing or even defunding or reducing the funds of police possible? And if so, what do you think that would look like? And I'll start with Antonia.
Man, I mean, that whole defund the police, first of all, the people who are in the movement don't even have a consensus of what they believe that looks like. So that's going to be part of the problem. What we're seeing is like when you see on CNN, and I was watching a couple of days ago when the Minneapolis city council president literally is having a conversation back and forth with Cuomo, and she cannot give a direct answer of what that actually looks like. There's some problems. But from what I've heard from most of the time what I've heard about people saying when they say defund the police, it seems like what they're really saying is reform the police. Do they mean take away funding, not all the funding, but reallocate funding from them and then go to, for example, community resources and stuff like that can go to things like that, can go to more de-escalation activities and stuff like that, and training, or in different ways of like working with the community? Yes, that's what I see a lot of. I see a lot of people saying that it's just lowering the budget, so they don't have the funding to get the type of militarization type of, weapons and stuff like that you're seeing, and tactics that they're seeing, that is really for the military and should be separate from police departments. So all of those together, I think, is civil asset forfeiture reform, stuff like that, to essentially reform the law enforcement culture in general, but also unions. It's interesting. Again, it's kind of that same thing where now they're talking about police unions. Essentially, it's different when they talk about teacher unions or whatever when it comes to accountability. But now they really want, police unions to be accountable for what they're doing, and so that's part of the reform that I'm seeing too when people talk about it. So personally, do I think that's actually going to happen, where they're going to literally disband police departments and stuff like that? No, I don't see that actually happening. But it's going to be interesting to see, like, we have 3 very different bills that are out right now, where we have Justin Amash, libertarian, who has unqualified immunity, and he was on the forefront with that. And then we have a Democrat-supported one that they're trying to push right now. And then we have a Republican one where Tim Scott, he said that he's going to be leading the path on that one as well. So it's going to be very different ways of how they say they're going to reform police. But for the most part, I think the big narrative is it is actually reforming police, not disbanding, not abolishing or defunding police.
Yeah, so that's, Tig, when we talk about defunding the police, because that's actually part of what we've started saying in our Joe's and my platform. When we're saying defunding the police, we mean at the federal level, ending civil asset forfeiture, where they basically steal property from people before trial. And if the charges are dropped or they're found not guilty, they have to sue the government to get their property back, that's just armed theft. So ending this military surplus program, where not only are they getting this ridiculous, military equipment that has no use in our neighborhoods, but also they're getting military-style training on how to use this military-style equipment, which sort of changes the whole mentality of what they're doing, where they increasingly see us as enemy combatants and our loved ones in our neighborhoods as war zones and potential people that are going to try and kill them. So that's what we talk about when we mean defunding police. But what are your thoughts overall on the defund the police movement? Do you think that that's a good thing? Do you think it's something that's possible? What do you think of that?
I mean, I think the points that you made about, police reform and making sure we don't militarize our law enforcement, I completely agree with that. I think defunding, especially some of these smaller police units, is going to be very harmful to a lot of the people asking to defund the police. I mean, imagine if they already don't have the resources apparently for training and continuing education. But if you are a community of minorities who don't have firearms, you don't, have access to any type of weapons, or you're not trained on how to use those weapons, and then you defund it, or you voted to defund your local law enforcement, then who are you going to call? Who's going to be there to protect you if they don't have the assets or resources that they need? Not the military assets, but just the regular law enforcement assets. Right. Yeah. Exactly. If they don't have those, then who are you going to call? What's going to happen when someone breaks into your house? It's going to force you to have to take responsibility for your own safety. And a lot of people still, even with everything that's going on, are not ready. Mentally, they cannot fathom being a gun owner. Mentally, they're still trying to warm up to the idea, but they're not ready to take control of their own safety. And, I respect that. But, there has to be some sort of answer. There has to be something in place to make sure that innocent civilians in these communities aren't just being taken advantage of by the people who, are criminals, who are going to take advantage of having less police patrols or less police funding in these neighborhoods.
That's fair. So you may have noticed I lit up when you said, who are they going to call? Because my first thought was what the Black Panthers did. I'm going to go on a very small anarchist rant now. So the Black Panthers saw their long, and I'm probably not telling either of you something you don't know. I'm telling the audience. The full name is the Black Panther Protection Party, I believe is what it was called. And the idea behind it was, I know I'm saying that name wrong now that I just said that. Anyway, the Black Panthers, their original purpose was they realized that the police weren't going to give them the protection that they wanted, and that the police were actually making their communities less safe and allowing criminals to have an influence there. And so they came up with an outside of government solution, which was protection councils and actual people that would go around and protect the community. People remember that they fought against, police brutality, but that wasn't all they did. They also fought to create basically a system of mutual aid and mesh protection networks in these communities, and starting in Oakland and in other communities around, mostly in California. And the whole idea behind it was, we'll provide for our own. We'll provide our own protection. You mentioned they actually started welfare. They started after-school lunch programs. They started mutual aid societies, and they were actually being, they were being influenced by far-left and anarchist propaganda about how you build solutions outside of a government that is designed to harm you. And of course, what happened as a result of that? The government came in and crushed everything they did. They killed Fred Hampton. They, they went after, everyone else that was involved in that. They destroyed Huey Newton and his life, and they destroyed everything else. They used counterintelligence programs to condition the white American public to believe that the Black Panthers were these dangerous criminals who were, just waiting to break into white neighborhoods and kill everyone, when the opposite was true. They wanted to be able to build their own community. I know I'm off on a whole rant. I'm sorry. So anyway, that's what, because whenever we get into, what would we do without the police, I immediately start ranting about the Panthers. So ladies, this has been absolutely amazing. I really appreciate both of your time and this opportunity to talk with you about these issues. Before we sign off, I want to give each of you a chance to give any final closing thoughts that you have, including promoting your organizations, anything you have coming up. I know you've already talked about the Range Day, but anything else, anything you have to promote, anything you thought that we should have touched on that we didn't, really anything at all that you would like to say. I'll start with Antonia, but Antonia and Tig, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Spike, for having us on. I really appreciate having a conversation like this. I think it's part of it, is having more conversations like this. So, when it comes down to what we've seen in the last few weeks, I'd probably say one of the most concerning things that I've seen are people who are on both sides using this opportunity to make it more about self-serving and less about the community itself, or in general even. When one community is hurting, then really no other community is doing as well as they should be. And we need to remember that. And so I think part of that is, as director of outreach for GOA, I see it as an outreach opportunity. I see trying to get more people on our side when it comes to this, and utilizing this obviously horrible situation, but hopefully using it so we can have more positive outcomes. And so it really, rhetoric matters, how you say things matter, and Black Lives Matter. Okay. And then no. But I'm not going to be as poetic as that, but essentially, yeah, but it's remembering, doing our own research, remembering that for the most part, other people have a good reason for what they're doing, and you should probably try and find out what that good reason is, instead of trying to find out what the bad part of that person is, or the criminal history of somebody is, or whatever, and find the grace and the redemption and the merciful side, the compassionate side of this whole conversation. And I think that's going to really lead a lot of us to remember that, we're all human beings, and to be a human being when we are replying to people that might be different than us or have a different perspective, but at the end of the day, they're just trying to live a better life and have a better life for their children and the people that they care about just as much as you do.
Thank you so much, Antonia. And you're right, because it's one thing to remember is, we're not saying that these folks that are the victims of police brutality are saints or angels. We're saying that they're murder victims. And we need to remember that whatever they didn't deserve to be murdered for it. So, but thank you for that. And Tig, the floor is now yours.
Sure. I just want to say thank you for inviting me to this conversation, Antonia. I really appreciate having conversations like these. I have a grassroots organization. I'm boots on ground. I get to look these women and these men in the face, and I see their concern. I see their frustrations. I see their fear. And I just wanted to say that National Range Day is happening on Saturday. We are going to go out in droves to the range, educate ourselves, and exercise our Second Amendment rights to self-defense. And I think it's something that it's not going to be the only time it ever happens. I want to do this more frequently, but I feel like if you're out there, if you're scared, if you feel like the country is not serving you, if you feel like your politicians are not serving you like they're supposed to do, as we are their employers, then go learn how to defend yourself. Go purchase a firearm. Go learn how to protect yourself. You can find that directory of participating firearms instructors in the link in my bio on Instagram. I am at My Sisters Keeper Defense. And then my website is mysisterskeeperdefense.com also.
Thank you. And Antonia, do you want a chance to plug your social media and website and so forth?
Yeah, you can find me talking a big game on Twitter and Instagram at Antonia_Okafor. And then, of course, become a GOA member. If you like what you're hearing, become a member and help what we're doing in our mission. So at gunowners.org. And we're going to be doing a lot more stuff on the outreach side. So if you want to get involved, email me, Antonia@gunowners.org, and let me know your ideas. Let me know how we can help you with things like what TIG is doing, stuff like that. If you have ideas like that or need help, I'm open in all ears. So just let me know, email or Twitter or Instagram for the most part.
The GOA, they're like the NRA, except they don't suck. Ladies, thank you so much for coming on my show. Please stick around. I want to talk with you during the outro. But folks, thanks again for tuning in to this episode of My Fellow Americans. I can't even begin to tell you all the things I'm going to be on. I'm doing multiple appearances every single day, so I can't even tell you where to start. I'll be sharing them on Muddied Waters and my social media, so when they happen, I'll be telling you. Some are live, some are pre-recorded. I can't even keep track of them anymore. But I do thank you for tuning in again. We will see you next week on Tuesday for the Muddy Waters of Freedom, where Matt Wright and I will parse through the week's events like the sweet summer boys that we are. And then on Wednesday, we will be having a Juneteenth special, and we'll be talking with Pat Carter, who is a local official who is in charge of the Juneteenth committee in Lee County, South Carolina. And we'll be talking about Juneteenth and the legacy behind that. And I would just like to thank you again for tuning in to this episode of My Fellow Americans. We will see you very soon, and God bless you.
They say about an eye for an eye in a time when the blind lead the blind. Who am I to deny? I would cry when a loved one dies. I recognize that body outside, full of holes in the body that was alive. Now confined to a chalk outline. Find out how, but you never know why. It ain't even make it to the news at 9. It ain't even make it to the news at 9. That's my sister, mother, father, brother, son. That's one of mine. All these years I close my eyes, open up to only find I'm in line. There's a pointless murder happening all the time. Either lose your life or mine. Caught up in their versus die. That ain't how it started, nah. How were we supposed to survive? There's a war going on outside. Who would want to raise a child? Whom the tomb is flashing by. Now you have to say goodbye when you watch them all